Okay. Hello and welcome to Dragons+Aliens, where we talk about fantasy and sci-fi books, new ones and some classics. I'm Jay, this is Simon, and
Hello.
today we're going to be talking about my top five fantasy reads of 2024, um, and what it means when a book is a fantasy horror crossover. That means we'll be delving into some of Stephen King's Dark Tower series. I'll be talking about Ryan LaSala's new book, Reverie, and we'll also be taking in the classic fantasy horror of Bram Stoker's Dracula and the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And can I just say that we are very excited about this episode, well, me particularly, as a fantasy fan, because Simon is joining us from a castle in France, an actual castle
I
in France.
am.
Are you able to do a little pan? You don't, when I WhatsApped you before, you definitely showed me some castle in France. Now you just look like you could be anywhere.
I look. Well, I am in a hotel, which was a castle, is a castle.
It's a castle.
I can't do it because you'll see my pants on my
Oh
bed.
no, no, we can't have your pants on the
Yeah,
internet. That would be bad.
I mean,
Okay.
when pants, underpants. I mean my trousers and things like that. My other
Oh, okay.
trousers.
I was
But
taking the British interpretation that we would see your actual pants.
I've got
Okay, well,
on. That's fine.
Simon did zing his phone around for me earlier, so I can confirm he is in a castle in France with a beautiful view that could come from a fancy
Yeah, and
novel.
there is a little story about this. That this castle was once a school for astronomers in the 17th century.
Love that. Love that.
Yes,
Amazing. Take some
yeah,
pictures. Go and find some of the astronomy
I'll do
tower
that.
bits. It's got an actual. That will
It has it's got a recreation of an astrolabe.
Oh my God, I've
Or
always wanted an astrolabe. That's
yeah,
amazing.
yeah,
Really
very cool.
exciting.
And
Okay,
I
well,
am
let's crack on because I know, as always, Simon, international traveler and castle dweller, is in a hurry. Um, so are we okay for me doing my top five fantasy books of 2024?
we should definitely do that.
I will do them really quickly. So my 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 favorite was Ryan LaSala's fantasy horror Beholder, which is a one-off novel set in the New York art world about a weird spider thing that comes through the mirrors and eats all the art critics. Also really loved Maggie Stiefvater's series, The Dreamer, which begins with Call Down the Hawk. It's a sequel to The Raven Boys, if anyone's seen that. And it's basically about what happens if you're a weird magical creature who has a cool gang of friends at high school, and then you can't go off, they all go off to university and you can't follow them because you're a weird magical creature. Stuff goes wrong. Also, really loved. It's new to me. It's not that new. The second part of Bardugo's Six of Crows trilogy. Amazing, amazing world building based on the former Russian Empire. That was a lot of YA fantasy, but I also really like this adult fantasy by N.K. Jemisin, sci-fi fantasy crossover, weird alien things attack New York City. New Yorkers have to defend. And some classic fantasy. I really loved Stephen King's The Gunslinger, which we're going to talk about in more detail. That's my 2024 roundup. Um, I think so. I think one of the themes that we wanted to talk about today, which I think is pertinent to both Beholder and The Gunslinger, um, both of these books, and I know you've read The Gunslinger and you like it, don't you, Simon? But both these books are, I mean, Stephen King is obviously best known as a horror writer. The Gunslinger is part of an epic fantasy. I think his real only fantasy series, which is an eight-book series, which I'm only three books into. The Gunslinger itself is kind of set in the Stephen King, in Stephen King books, people are always getting pulled into this horrible place in the drains or through the walls where the monsters live. This is a book set in that place, and I loved it. I thought it was wonderful. I think there are some problematic things about the later books in the series, but this one was just perfect. It's about a boy from um, New York who dies and finds himself waking up in this fantasy world with the monsters. And what do you do when you actually have to live there? Um, what was it you liked about The Gunslinger, Simon?
Well, let me get. Can I give you some backstory on it? I Well, first of all, I'm going to correct you. It's not the only fantasy novels that Stephen King wrote. He wrote
Uh-huh.
a novel called The Eyes of the Dragon,
Uh-huh.
which I read when I was about 10 or 11. Again, from the forbidden bit of Sherburn Elm at library. I liked it because it was fantasy and I was too scared to read horror at the time. I tried to read Stephen King's horror and it genuinely upset me.
No, I
And
couldn't
actually,
read it when I
I
was a
still can't.
teenager. It was awful.
Yeah, both it and Pet Cemetery just really
Pet
disturbed me. So,
Cemetery, no way. I read the first page and then I
oh,
just
awful.
freaked out.
I mean, brilliant storytelling, but awful. What an awful trauma to read. So I read The Eyes of the Dragon and I really loved it. I've not read it since, but I still remember a lot about it. And that book connects to The Dark Tower because, at least my understanding of Stephen King, and I know there'll be people watching this who might correct both you and I, is that everything he's ever written, apart from the latter stuff that is the kind of gumshoe novels, is all connected to the Dark Tower. Everything. So it's all mapped out in this kind of, again, the concept we use is multiverse. I don't think that's a very useful concept for this, but it was all mapped out with that. So Randall Flagg from The Stand appears in the Dark Tower and also appears in an iteration. And again, it all comes back to Michael Moorcock. We've mentioned this at least 3 times. Comes back and is the chief antagonist of The Eyes of the Dragon. What I really love about The Gunslinger is, of course, this very simple mashup of Western horror and fantasy that all come together. And of course, Stephen King based his idea for the Dark Tower on a reoccurring dream he had, I believe a reoccurring dream, about Childe Rowland, the narrative poem by, I think, Shelley. Is that
It's
right?
by
I should have
Robert
checked that.
Browning. It was written in
That's
the late
Brown,
Victorian period, so around
of
1880, I think. Yeah.
Childe Rowland to the Dark Tower came.
Which is about a knight going on a quest to find a dark tower across this blasted landscape, which is scary and horrible.
So I read The Dark Tower when I was a little bit older than that, maybe 11 or 12. Didn't really understand it. It was really odd because it had the edition had full color plates, paintings in it in a kind of realistic style, which is really strange for me.
Wow. Were they good?
Yeah, they were good. They were like something you'd get in a Western novel. My dad had some like Reader's Digests, and if you read any of the Western stuff, they always had these color plates of kind of, I don't know, Jack Vetranio, that kind of style art. And you never see that in fantasy. So that was really odd. And I remember there was a picture of the car, maybe knocking over I can't remember the boy's
Yeah.
name. Yeah,
And
weird.
it's
Jake.
Jake, I mean, it's a strange, but you sort of think you're in a fantasy world in which this guy is either a gunslinger from the Old West or a kind of knight. But then it's weird. There are elements of it, like there are elements that are clearly not of our world, like knights and castles, but then there are gas stations, there's old music from the 50s playing. So it's kind of our world and kind of not. Um,
Yeah.
and then he encounters this boy who has died in New York, who wakes up in this world, and they go on a really creepy journey, which has kind of reminded me a lot of the Wes Craven's Nightmare on Elm Street films in
Yeah.
the period in the
Good.
80s. This was written in the 80s, and
Yeah.
it's like this creepy, really creepy, twisted landscapes, horror underground, being
Yeah.
trapped, having to walk on a precipice over a chasm, all the
Yeah.
yeah.
Clearly. Yeah. And it's quite a brief novel, isn't it? It's not a very long one.
It's not
And
a
they get
novel. They get really
eventually
long. This is the novel. I'm about to read the fourth novel in the series, which again, doing
the
the
Wolves of the Camp.
expanding thing. Um,
Yeah.
I'm up to book three. And yeah, I'm going to read all 8 of them. I've heard they're not that great after book 5, but let's see how it goes. So what I'm interested in, and I think probably The Dark Tower is not the greatest example of this because The Dark Tower is not only excellent world building, but it's an attempt to draw all of Stephen King's thought and all of his other novels into a fantasy system and using fantasy as a way of, well, it is interesting. I kind of think it is relevant because what he's trying to do is use fantasy here as a way of systemizing horror, which he's had in his horror novels. And because horror tends to be local. And I find that interesting. Whereas fantasy can often be a very big, highly constructed world, and
Yeah.
either what you call high fantasy, where it's when it's not recognizably in our world at all, or what they call urban fantasy, which is when it's in our world, but there is but a fantasy realm intrudes or is crossed over into, or there are vampires or something like that. Um, Usually horror. Most horror has fantasy elements, not always, but most horror has fantasy elements because it's about, usually there's something happening that's supernatural in some way, but usually it's just happening to you and you don't really understand it. It would be scary if you did say, oh, we're clearly in this big world system, and so the fact that you don't understand it is creepy, but usually it's just my house is behaving weirdly. There are people going missing in my neighborhood, but it's never fitted into a wider system. And so what I'm interested in, and this is also the case in this book, which I was talking about, where um, these monsters start coming through the mirrors at this specific sector of New York art parties, and eating the guests. And it's about, it's about a monster possibly from another dimension that craves beauty and art. It has a wonderful Oscar Wilde style line of the monsters are drawn into the wallpaper because it's the only form of art you can't get rid of. But there's no attempt to systematize it. It's just a one-off novel in which creepy shit starts happening. And so I guess this is my question for you, Simon, because I know you have deep thoughts about this stuff. In what way is this fantasy, and in what way is it horror? I mean, obviously there's slasher horror and gore horror, which doesn't contain fantasy, but when it does, when it has creepy spiders from aliens, I mentioned, is it fantasy or is it horror, and what's going on?
I think it might. Well, I've got loads, as always, Jake. There's so much brilliance in what you just said. I think the first thing to say is that there are some exceptions to what you said about world building. The big one would be Lovecraft, right? Which overshadows, I think, interestingly, not just 20th century horror and 21st century horror, but 20th and 21st century fantasy. And that's a really important thing to come
That is
to.
really
And I
important.
think it's,
He is a horror writer who has a system
yeah,
and a big world building thing going on. Yes.
so much so that there is a role playing system based on it. And I do
We
know
have
that
played
a
this.
lot of, yeah, we have the Call of Cthulhu, but like the grim dark idea of fantasy, which started with the world building that actually Games Workshop did with Warhammer, and then is popularized by novels in the late 90s and then early 21st century. I think owes as much to Lovecraft as to other things. So I
Yeah.
think that's really important. And in terms of what the instinct with horror is, I wonder, and this might tie in with both Dracula and
Jekyll and
what else
Hyde.
we discussed, Jekyll and Hyde, is that although they are much later than Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, I have often thought that Frankenstein Gothic horror that develops through to those novels is the mirror image of the romantic ideal. So if
Yeah.
the romantic ideal is about the divine, but not necessarily God, but the sense of majesty and awe at the universe, horror is its shadow opposite, which is the sense of despair, the sense of terror, the sense of inability to act at the scale of the universe, which
Yeah,
I
and
think is
often
manifest.
it's quite tied to that romantic sensibility. Often,
Yeah,
obviously, Mary Shelley was part of the romantic, late
yeah,
romantic movement, and married to Percy Shelley, the poet, and it's a lot to do with their revulsion against science and industrialization. So
yeah,
Shelley, Frankenstein's about a weird science going wrong. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is also about, again, it's a really good example of like local creepy stuff happening in my locality that isn't part of a wider system. It's
Yeah,
actually
yeah,
almost not a fantasy book. It's a weird science book. In fact, that all that really happens in this book is that Dr. Jekyll, who has unspecified, horrific, unnameable, implied sexual desires of the kind that people often seem to have in the late Victorian period, and nobody could write them down because they were too dreadful, but has these urges and
yeah.
and manages in his doctor's laboratory to create a cordial, I can't remember how it's described, a medicine using a specific ingredient, which transforms him into this alter ego Hyde, who has no problem acting out Jekyll's sexual weird urges.
And actually, I just wanted to say something about Stephen King, and we'll come back to this in a second. But
Yeah.
I think one of the things that is interesting about Stephen King generally, as a horror writer, and I'm by no means an expert, is that novels like The Stand in Stephen King, which is a post-pandemic horror novel with elements, but the horror comes from the way in which humanity treat each other.
Hmm.
And the elements that are really fantasy is an attempt to make the local systemic and global. And I think that's partially what drives a lot of Stephen King's success. So there's early novels like Cujo and The Shining, and effectively Christine. Those novels are very localized and they're very rooted in time and place. But the later novels from the kind of mid '80s onwards, as he's writing The Dark Tower, coincidentally, start to have a kind of global impact. And then he's able to revisit the local very often in his short stories, which I think is really interesting because he
That's really
writes locale.
interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, you've read a lot more Stephen King than me, but that seems to me to be like that. I mean, in a sense, fantasy and horror are the same in this.
yeah,
And like horror is when a little tiny bit of of fantasy intrudes into your urban world and you can't handle it and it's terrifying. And then fantasy is when it becomes part of a system that somehow makes sense and you're able to start enjoying it, perhaps. Does
yeah. I would say that, and I think that's interesting, isn't it? Because again, part of the Dark Tower is a way to explain what the world that he sees is, whereas
yeah.
other horror functions because it's inexplicable. So that there's no explanation to Victor Frankenstein's monster. There's no apart from the fact that he created it and
Yeah, apart from the
that's
fact that it
no
ostensibly maybe just grew in a lab, which is the case
yeah
again with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, that,
yeah
it might have just been, again, it's sort of
yeah.
like there's a big science is bad theme around this.
And interestingly, Dracula, which we'll come on to, which just the wellspring. And I'm a big fan of that book, actually. I think it's a really, pardon me, I've got a frog in my throat, a really
Bless you.
underrated novel. And I think it's underrated because it's structurally so interesting.
It's
Everybody
so
should read
good. I read it recently. I just thought this is really pacey, well written.
it.
And what I really liked, well, I mean, you have to, I guess, if you're going to read it, you have to get over some of the initial stuff. It feels really on the nose, like Jonathan Harker is approaching the castle and people keep going, beware, beware, do not go to the castle. And if you do, be sure to take a cross and some garlic with you. And wolves are howling and bats are screeching. But that is because Jonathan Harker is effectively inventing the vampire novel. These things weren't cliches at that time. Jonathan
No,
Harker,
it doesn't
Bram
signify
Stoker.
anything.
Yeah.
It doesn't signify anything to him because that stuff was again the tradition of the vampire goes back thousands of years, but it's not what there isn't one wellspring. And what
There
Bram
isn't.
Stoker does, because there isn't, they're present in all different cultures in different
Yeah,
ways.
I mean, I read the collection of other Victorian vampire stories
Yeah,
recently, which were written before and around that time. And there are lots of different kind of vampires, but they're not in. A lot of them are psychic vampires, vampires that draw on your
yeah,
psychic energy or invade your dreams. It's not as good as Bram Stoker's Dracula. I mean, he invents
yeah.
so much stuff in this book, including, I think this is the earliest example of, well, it's the earliest example I've seen of like a gang of young people emerging to fight the monster.
he basically, yeah. I mean, it's Buffy
Yeah,
before
it's
Buffy.
basically Buffy, like this group of
Yeah.
young people, like Lucy's has these three suitors
Well,
who help
I
her
mean,
and
we're joking about it, but of course, actually, now I think about it, that is exactly what Buffy is. Like Giles is Van Helsing, and all of that. And
I
I
was
never.
surprised. Yeah, sorry, Simon, I keep interrupting you. Go
No,
on.
no, it's
Uh,
fine. But I would say that point about Jonathan Harker is that he's not aware of the genre tropes. It's like the first if you watch an early slasher film, like for example Psycho, right?
yeah.
So she doesn't know not to get in the shower because nobody's been murdered in a shower like that before.
Yeah, no one
So
would
that's
ever get in a
not,
shower now
you know,
like that. Yeah.
there's just nobody in the hotel. And of course once that infects the readership and viewership, then we're all, then of course you can play with genre. But it is the first example of that. There is, by the way, a fantastic novel by, oh my gosh, I can't remember his name. I believe it is the late Sinead O'Connor's, Joseph O'Connor, I think,
Uh-huh.
called Shadowplay, about the writing of Dracula and the relationship between Bram Stoker and Henry Irving and
Oh,
Oscar Wilde. And it's a
interesting.
brilliant read.
Oh, I really
But
want to
that
read that. I would want to read that. That sounds
really
amazing.
great, really great, really great. And I don't know
Yeah,
where
I
we
mean the
come
Van
from with that, but of
Helsing
course,
thing. Sorry.
yeah. Well, the only thing I was going to say is that actually, whilst on the one hand it's world building Dracula, on the other it's not, because Dracula appears completely alone in the world.
Yeah, he
Like
does
there's
have
no,
these brides in his castle, and Van Helsing. It's not like he's part of an international group of vampires. He's just this
yeah,
weird. Van Helsing. So I was surprised because I've seen a lot of later iterations of Van Helsing in which he's quite kick-ass vampire fighter with lots of gadgets and stakes. And in the book, he's not. He's this sort of kindly old academic gentleman who helps
yeah,
the young people and who manages through academic study. I mean, he's very Giles-like. You're right, Giles in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, because he just manages to work out from other books and older sources what is going on with the vampire. But yeah, it's just
yeah,
the one-off vampire, and it's not. And interestingly, it spawned, vampires are now one of the absolute staples of fantasy. I mean, they're slightly out of vogue at the moment, but they're not, I mean, they will come back and ha ha ha. Um, and,
uh,
um,
we
you know,
should put a,
they've become an
yeah.
absolute fantasy, you know.
Well, we should put a pin in another series of novels that don't get talked about ever, uh, which I've not read for many years, and I didn't read all of them because there's so many of them. But the Necroscope series by
I haven't
Brian
read
Lumley,
those. Should I read those?
really yeah, you should. Now, Brian Lumley also wrote Titus Crow, which was a kind of offshoot and exists in the universe of H.P. Lovecraft. So
Uh-huh.
we kind of come full circle with that, and that is definitely world building. Necroscope is about it's a cross between fantasy, horror, science fiction, and a spy novel. Because essentially, necroscopes are people who can speak to the dead, and they are recruited by the MI6 and MI5. And at the same time, there's a whole system of vampires, which are a kind of parasite that lives inside you, which it turns out come from a different planet. And it's really out there. It would be a fantastic TV series. But again, I think a lot of these novels from the 80s have just been forgotten. They're just not talked about, mentioned. That's an interesting
It is. Well, as
thing.
I was saying to another writer friend at the moment who's been watching Dragons and Aliens, you can probably see this in the comments. I said to her, um, it's good for us as writers because it means we can, be inspired by a lot of stuff from the 80s and bring it into our works. I think yeah, so much good stuff there. And are we ready? Should we be wrapping up now? How are you doing for time?
We probably need to start wrapping up. I'm sorry to say.
Yeah, no, this is
Uh,
good. This is a good length, but I'm going to read that. Let's just do a little reading recap. How are you getting on with Assassin's Apprentice?
Absolutely, I think it's fantastic. And again, I'd seen in my kind of time off from fantasy, which is when I was reading serious literature at university, I I would see her name plastered everywhere, and I think it's interesting. I don't think that the covers sell
We're
the
talking about this
novels.
book.
And I think that quote from George R. Martin is so apposite on the front cover because she writes characters
We say.
fantastically.
He
Oh
says, in
God,
today's
yeah,
crowded fantasy market, Robin Hobb's books are like diamonds in a sea of zircons. Yeah, absolutely. Without knowing what a zircon is, I
yeah.
nevertheless agree with this.
And what's interesting is that she plays with, what could be cliche. So abandoned orphan, trained assassin, where do we start with that? I mean, there's shades of everything from Tolkien, because effectively Frodo's an orphan, through to, the Shadow of the Torturer, Book of the New Sun.
Mhm.
And I think, world building that's basically Vikings, look at, the Winter of the World series, which we need to talk about at some stage. So none of it's new, but it's all just really well animated. Although I'm not sure Harry White, she gets a get out clause because it's a male narrating from age. But I'm not sure, weirdly, how well she writes women. But I'm only on book one. Like
Yeah,
Molly
it's
doesn't come
true.
across it.
I didn't find I don't well, I think she doesn't write romance well, and she doesn't write women
Mm-hmm.
in a particularly. I mean, Ketragun is a good character. There are some strong female characters in there, but
Yeah,
and Molly, she writes Molly's perspective well, I think. This is me having read the full trilogy, and I have some
yeah,
friends. In fact, creating a library who follows us has read all 15 books in the Robin Hobb series,
yeah.
and he's assured me that it's worth going to the end. But see how you go with that. And I've been
I'm
reading.
enjoying.
You're enjoying it, so we'll see how you get on with that this month. Well, I'll do a little reading roundup maybe next time, but I've also read another really good horror fantasy novel called
Yeah.
Bunny, which I'll talk about next time. But I really enjoyed that a lot. And I've been reading some sci-fi. I read Project Hail Mary, which I thought was okay. Um, and yeah, and some more
Well,
by
if we're going to put in some other things to talk about to pick up some of these threads, because I think this is where this is developing, we should put a pin in talking about, I think her name's Cassandra Clare, and
yes.
her kind of spin-off, urban fantasy spin-off from uh, Lovecraft. We should put a pin in talking about M. John Harrison. I've only ever read one novel by him, but it's a novel called Light. That
Okay,
really
well, if
stands.
you recommend it, I'll check it out.
Light is a weird sci-fi horror mashup, I think, which is a different genre. And we should talk about Chanami Evil, because the
Yes,
city in the city you talked about when we were doing some voice notes, and I love that.
it's
That's not
great.
fantasy. Dido Street Station.
Well, or
This,
is it though? City and City kind of is fantasy in that there are these two cities
yeah,
that inhabit the same space. I mean, I guess
yeah.
that could technically happen. Um,
But it could also be
it's a
Borgia.
slight, it's a slight commentary on Israel Palestine. I felt with like a small crowded area with lots of with people living in the same space, or possibly on the former Yugoslavia as well.
Well, I would say it's all those things, but I would say it's more in the kind of, it's a kind of literary. It sits in the realm, I would say, something like Georges Louis Borges. Like it's a
Yeah.
kind of thought experiment that works really well. But which is not to dismiss the fact it might be fantasy, but very specifically, he has written a fantasy series, starting with Perdita Street Station, The Scar, and Iron Council. And Perdita Street Station is definitely a horror novel,
Yeah, I
100%.
got a bit freaked out by the
Ooh,
cockroach
the
sex.
moth.
I got freaked
God.
out by the cockroach sex and then I stopped reading, but I know I should
Yeah,
persist.
yeah, 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 yeah. Well, it's not a cockroach. You know what I mean.
They're like cockroaches, they're insects, and I will check. I will check. I will check and I'll finish
We should
Potato
definitely.
Street Station. I thought Kraken was really boring though.
I've not
Um,
read it.
um, but we'll talk about him in another series.